Welcome to our special Workers' Day episode of Design Emergency, where we will explore the profound impact of design on social progress through the lens of work. This is Paola Antonelli speaking, and with me is Alice Rawsthorn. Hello, Alice.
Hi, Paola.
So, work is not just a means to earn a living. It's a cornerstone of human civilization and personal identity. Historically, of course, from a Western perspective, the concept of work has evolved significantly, reflecting the values and the circumstances of different cultures and eras. In ancient civilizations, for instance, work was often tied to survival and to social structure, whether it was hunting and gathering, and then in agrarian society, cultivating land and managing livestock and cooking at home for the family, and so on and so forth. But the ancient Greeks, however, already introduced a bifurcated view of work. While manual labor was necessary, it was often looked down upon compared to the intellectual pursuits of philosophy and politics. And if we fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, the definition of work shifted dramatically again. The introduction of machinery and factory systems not only changed what work looked like, but also where and how it was performed. The period marked a significant shift towards the cities and gave rise to a new social class. New social classes, actually plural, we should say, and dynamics, highlighting issues of workers' rights and economic equity that continue to spark discussions today. Karl Marx, of course, he had a profound impact on the understanding of work, especially in the context of capitalism. For Marx, work was primarily an act through which workers could express their labor power. However, under capitalism, he argued that work became alienated from the worker. This meant that workers were estranged from the products of their labor, from the labor process, from their fellow workers, and from their own human potential. According to Marx, this alienation was a result of workers not owning the means of production, which led to their exploitation, as they could not claim a direct relationship with what they produced or how they produced it. And if we move into the 20th century, there's an intellectual that we seem to never be able to get enough of, Hannah Arendt. And she offered a distinct philosophical take of work in her 1958 book, The Human Condition. She differentiated between labor and work. And she described labor as a never-ending process bound to the biological and societal necessities of human survival, which corresponds closely to Marx's concept of alienated labor. And in contrast, work, for Arendt, involved the creation of a durable world, of artifacts, of systems that could outlast individual lives, thereby providing a sense of permanence and stability essential to human civilization. And with one more jump, we get to the 21st century, where the definition of work has expanded again to include the concept of the knowledge worker, a term that was popularized by Peter Drucker in the latter half of the 20th century, but fully realized in recent decades. Knowledge workers are primarily engaged in creating, manipulating, and managing information. Work for these individuals is characterized by cognitive engagement rather than manual labor. It's often collaborative and increasingly remote, leveraging digital technology to innovate and to solve complex problems. So, work really gets characterized and contextualized in many different ways, from geopolitical and scale to the color. And by the way, there are so many more colors in the spectrum of work than blue or white. There's also green, pink, gray, gold. But here, I just go for a tangent. Suffices to say that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics has 23 basic categories listed. Also, attempts to reform and revolutionize the idea of work and the practice of work are being devised at all times, from the 4-day work week that France instituted to the idea of universal basic income that would free the productivity from actual labor. And indeed, in contemporary times, the definition of work has become more inclusive, complex, and at times confusing, encompassing not only physical and manual labor, but also creative endeavors. The rise of the gig economy, digital nomadism are more recent examples. And what is interesting is that they are all born from different fractures in our history, because work is also very sensitive to the vagaries of history. There have been several watershed moments in this century only, for instance, the dot-com boom and bust, and then 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, and of course, the pandemic. As in every revolution or emergency, design is there all the time, whether it is about designing new ping-pong table and oat milk-fueled workspaces for startups, or co-working lounges for millennials, or converting massive office buildings and resuscitating old neighborhoods after the COVID-19 pandemic, not to mention tools and objects, interfaces of apps of all kinds, infrastructures, legislations to accommodate movement in all its forms, from subsistence-based to privilege, from migrant workers to digital nomads. Design is always involved. It's about reshaping the environments, it's about making work more humane and efficient, and it's also about workers' rights. And here I give the word to Alice, that I know has a lot to say about the topic.
Well, as Paola has explained, work as a concept has changed constantly over time, but one thing has remained: the global battle to secure and sustain workers' rights, which has been a crucial aspect of political activism throughout history. Now, diverse forms of design have been central to these protests, go-slows, walkouts and strikes, notably by creating apt and memorable symbols to raise awareness of abuses and the need to fight for justice. An example is, of course, the raised fist, an ancient sign of strength and unity in the face of oppression, which has long been a popular symbol for trade unions and other workers' rights movements. So has the red flag, both as a song, long established as an anthem for the international labour movement, and also as a flag which has flown worldwide to signify outrage and defiance since its adoption by anti-royalist Jacobins in the 1789 French Revolution. 10 years later, a group of British sailors, staging a mutiny against their dire working conditions, raised their red flags on their ships on the River Thames in London. And in 1831, 10,000 coal miners took to the streets of South Wales to protest against their lot in the Merthyr Rising, carrying 2 red flags. Both were made by the miners by soaking cotton sheets in calf's blood, in the first recorded time that red flags were used to symbolise workers' power. Yet one of my favourite examples of workers' rights and the symbolism of it stems from a milestone for both the labour movement and the women's movement in the UK, the Bryant and May Match Girls strike of 1888. At that time, Bryant and May employed over 5,000 workers at its East London match factory, mostly young women or girls, who staged a series of strikes in the 1880s over their paltry pay, 14-hour working days, compulsory fines for minor misdemeanours, and dangerous working conditions, which included the high risk of contracting a rare form of bone cancer known as phossy jaw from working with phosphorus to make the matches. In 1888, the activist Annie Besant conducted an investigation into all of the above and published her conclusions in her newspaper, The Link. She also reported that in 1882, Theodore H. Bryant, co-owner of the factory, had deducted 1 shilling from each worker's pay, obviously without consulting them, and securing their agreement to contribute towards the cost of erecting a statue to the politician and Prime Minister William Gladstone outside the factory. Annie Besant wrote that the match girls, as they were known, were so furious that they went to the unveiling ceremony with stones in their pockets so they could throw them at the statue in protest, and some of them cut their hands so they could smear blood on the base. Bryant and May tried to force its employees to sign a statement refuting Annie Besant's claims, and when one refused, she was fired, and 1,400 match girls went on strike in protest for 12 days. The management finally agreed to their demands, and the employee was reinstated and a match girls trade union formed, although it would be another 10 years before Bryant and May stopped using phosphorus in production. The courage of the match girls has never been forgotten, and on the 100th anniversary of the strike, strike in 1988, an unknown admirer paid tribute to them by covering one of Gladstone's hands on the statue with red paint. The local council has since removed the paint on a regular basis, only for Gladstone's hand to be repainted in red overnight. A seemingly modest gesture, but a very powerful one in the design history of workers' rights symbolism. And as a footnote, the once bustling Bryant and May factory is now a gated residential community. What else could it have been turned into? Described on its website as, and I quote, a vibrant residential development, British Victorian architecture meets New York loft apartment to create a truly unique living experience. Well, real estate agents always say that, don't they?
This is such a beautiful example of fight for workers' rights. And it's really amazing to see how the issue of worker safety has not yet been resolved. I'm thinking, of course, 2015 and the Rana Plaza tragedy in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where a whole building collapsed over all these workers. But also very recently, in Italy, there were strikes because of some incidents on work. So it is quite amazing. And many of these workers are almost invisible. And this leads me to talk about my second example. So I remember when I came to the United States, there were two books that really shaped my understanding of work in the US. One was by a journalist, Studs Terkel. It's called Working. People talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. It was from 1976, and it was a collection of interviews in which American workers from diverse backgrounds described their jobs, their aspirations. It was almost like a reality book about daily work in the States. And then there was a second book by journalist Barbara Ehrenreich that was called Nickel and Dimed, on not getting by in America. That was in 2001. And it was an exploration of the struggles of low-wage workers in America. She really went undercover, Barbara Ehrenreich, and took various jobs at minimum wage and tried to survive, to experience and expose the difficulties about living at that level. That's why today I want to focus on workers that are normally almost invisible. And my next example is design adjacent, but it's something that I admire tremendously. It's the work of Meryl Latterman-Eukeles, a wonderful, fierce artist that since 1977 until very recently was the artist in residence at the New York Sanitation Department. So we're talking about the sanitation workers, the people that collect trash in New York City. So Meryl is a very influential figure in contemporary art still. She's 85 and she's still active and speaks speaks everywhere about her work. And she was working in a very pioneering way in performance, in feminist, and in maintenance art. So her concept of maintenance art is very important. She introduced it in a manifesto for maintenance art in 1969. And in that manifesto, she argued about the importance of maintenance activities that are those tasks that sustain daily life as opposed to the creation of new things. She saw that as deeply intertwined with the feminist critique of undervalued domestic roles traditionally held by women. So it was almost like a foresight of the debate that is happening right now on the care industry. So she posited that maintenance, both as practice and as metaphor, should be considered as art. Her most famous long-term project was called Touch Sanitation, and it was in 1979. It took years. She performed it over actually less than a year, but then it continued 11 months, but then she invited the rest of the people. During this period, she personally met with circa 8,500 sanitation workers in New York, shaking each one's hand and acknowledging their essential role in the maintenance of the city with the phrase, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." This project not only highlighted the social invisibility of these workers, but also the essential nature of their work, promoting a new consciousness about the city's operational infrastructures. She then invited with other performances also citizens to come and shake all these workers' hands. And her work extended well beyond the specific performances. She also did public art installations, she did exhibitions, she collaborated, it was very articulated in her residency period. And she continued to address the issue of labor, of environmental maintenance, and also the everyday aesthetics of service activities. In the 1980s and 90s, she also organized these mesmerizing ballets. She did one, for instance, with snow workers in Japan, in which all the workers took their plows. There's no plows, and had this coordinated ballet in which they showed their dexterity with this big machinery. So the reflection on this often invisible labor that supports and sustains society is particularly resonant in the discussion of design and work, as it prompts a reconsideration of value, of creativity, and sustainability in contemporary life.
Wow, I had never heard of her work, but what extraordinary performances, and so sad that they're as urgently needed today, if not more so, given the precarity of so many people's working circumstances as they were at the time. So on to our third example, which is to look at the design of the workplace, a crucial component, obviously, of the working experience, even at a time of rising home working, where the impact of design is decisive in determining whether it will be positive, negative, or downright horrific. Millions of workplaces are, of course, hostile environments, but not all of them, as the early 20th century French fashion designer Madeleine Vionnet demonstrated with great élan. Vionnet is renowned for designing sleekly elegant clothes that reflected the natural lines of women's bodies, in stark contrast to the stiff, corseted, ornate fashions of the time. And she's famed for the technical ingenuity with which she pioneered and perfected bias cut dresses in the 1930s, worn by screen sirens like Marlene Dietrich, Greta Garbo, and Katharine Hepburn. But she also pioneered decent terms and working conditions for her staff in fashion, an industry that to this day has an egregious reputation for mistreating them. Vionnet's concern for her employees was rooted in her own experience of being born into poverty in rural France in 1876 and starting her working life as a trainee seamstress in a fashion house at the age of 11. She refined her skills in a succession of jobs, still as a seamstress in London and then in Paris fashion houses, eventually opening her own in 1912 at the age of 36. And from the outset, her approach to running the business was as radical as her aesthetic, particularly with regard to the treatment of her staff. All Madeleine Vionnet's employees were given fair pay, free lunches and coffee breaks, as well as paid holidays, 3 weeks in summer and 1 in winter. They were also offered free healthcare and dentistry, as well as daycare for their kids and access to care for elderly parents. Younger employees and new recruits could attend classes to improve their skills, to enhance their chances of promotion, more senior posts and better wages, and all the staff had chairs with backrests as opposed to the cheap stools used in other fashion houses. And I would imagine that if you hadn't worked as a seamstress, that little subtlety would not have occurred to you. And not content with setting new standards for human relations, Vionnet also successfully introduced copyright law to fashion before she closed her house in 1940 during World War II. So a remarkable woman whose personal experience of labour exploitation fueled her determination to use her power as an entrepreneur and business owner to pioneer an enlightened approach to designing and running an empowering and productive place for people to work.
I don't want to stereotype, but there are so many female pioneers that really also pioneered better conditions for workers. I don't want to stereotype, but I do. What can we do? It's a beautiful example, Madeleine Vionnet. So I would like to continue my loving contemplation of invisible work using design and art, talking about factory workers. And I would like now to bring the example of the work of Revital Cohen and Tour Van Balen, that are designer artists based in London. They made this beautiful work a few years ago called 75 Watt. And the title comes from the Marx Standard Handbook for Mechanical Engineers. Marx, not M-A-R-X, but rather M-A-R-K-S. I need to highlight the average laborer, according to this manual, can sustain an output of about 75 watts over the course of an 8-hour day. So hence the title. So the designers collaborated with choreographer and Royal Ballet Fellow Alexander Whitley and with workers at the White Horse Electric Factory in Jiangshan in China, in the Pearl River Delta, which at that time was the epicenter of Made in China. Together, they created a beautiful assembly line dance. So Whitley designed the whole choreography while at London in the Royal Ballet Studios, and then had one day of rehearsal in the factory with the workers prior to the one-day on-site filming in China. So the workers actually cooperated with him to create this ballet. And production line work, in a way, is always a dance of its own design. It's a logical, mechanical choreographing of the best time and energy efficient movements possibly for the task at hand. So he needed the input of the workers to understand this really delicate task. And the outcome of the project was, of course, the choreography, a beautiful video, and also 40 objects, and I have to say 6 of them together with the video are in MoMA's collection very proudly. And these objects had no practical function. Their existence was intended specifically to choreograph the motions of the workers. Their design was turning the routine activities into something visible, even though it was a dance. So lots of ballet today, because performance and dance are great ways to reveal spheres of activity to a wider audience. And as my colleague Pamela Popeson wrote in a beautiful blog, we all choreograph our daily movements and design our living and working spaces with some sort of logic in mind, whether knowingly or unknowingly. This work also reminds me of Grete Schulte-Lihotzky famed Frankfurt Kitchen of 1926, the first attempt to kind of choreograph spatially the work of a housewife. And by placing attention on the process instead of the result, the artist designers sought to question, and these are their words, the nature of mass manufacturing products on various scales, from the geopolitical context of labor to the biopolitical condition of the human body on the assembly line. And once again, the involvement of the workers, who can be seen as really enjoying the performance in the video, is another way to give dignity and visibility to work that very often remains hidden.
And another wonderful example of that, though it's slightly inverted, is there's a 1960s film clip of Martha and the Vandellas, the great Motown act, and they're singing and indeed dancing along to their single Nowhere to Run in the Ford Baton Rouge factory in Detroit. So they literally follow a Ford car, I think it's a Thunderbird, but I'm not sure from memory, through all stages of production as the production workers are continuing their daily tasks and their routine. And you're absolutely right, Paola, there is this balletic undertone to the nature of their movements, of both the machinery and the people. So, on to another hugely important area of work, and indeed workers' rights, where design has played a critical role for centuries, and this is skills training, the possibility of improving workers' skills to improve their lot. And this has been a fertile area for design innovation for centuries, from the woodworking classes run by Louise Brigham's Home Thrift Association for thousands of kids from economic disadvantaged families in early 20th century New York, to the creative training currently offered to migrants and asylum seekers in the northern Italian city of Treviso in the Talking Hands workshops founded by a local art director, Fabrizio Rotini, who I interviewed for Design Emergency a year or so ago. Now, they're both great examples of how design and making skills, or learning them, has helped people in deeply difficult circumstances, as is Startup Lions, a digital empowerment program that teaches digital schools to young people in rural Kenya. So it's sort of like a contemporary, cruising into mid-21st century version of Louise Brigham's classes back in New York. Startup Lions was founded in 2015, and it operates from a solar-powered training campus designed by the Burkinabe-born, Berlin-based architect Diabedo Francis Carré, beside Lake Turkana in northwest Kenya. 1 million people live in the surrounding area, but they have very limited employment opportunities, making it extremely difficult for them, for young people especially, to find work. And even if they find it, it's almost impossible for them to earn more than subsistence wages. So Startup Lions designed the Learning Lions project as a one-year series of courses to teach digital communications and entrepreneurial skills with young people who all have talent and intelligence, but no previous IT training and relatively limited education. They also run a parallel program, Digital Nomads, which is a series of shorter courses specially devised to enable the growing number of people who want or need to work remotely to develop their digital and design skills. And their future plans include establishing the Wakanda, yes, Black Panther reference, Girls' Secondary School of Digital Excellence nearby, which will be the first fully digital girls' school in Kenya. It'll offer mentorship programs and a daycare centre for kids so students can continue their education even after they've become mothers. And over the long term, Startup Lions intends to open training campuses in other regions to enable people across the African continent to realise their creative potential and to secure well-paid, sustainable employment, which will benefit the wider economy in their regions as well as themselves. So a brilliant example of a really practical design solution to a very complex problem being implemented in a very imaginative and thoughtful way.
And it's about inclusion, right? It's about including people that didn't have access before into a sphere of activity and a system that gives them dignity and a sense of belonging and being, and also the power to earn a living and a more than subsistence living. And I was thinking about this inclusivity. It's a different example, but I've always loved it so much. There are so many efforts right now to include in the working universe also people that traditionally have been excluded because of mental issues or also because of age. Ageism is a big issue. And it just reminds me of this great episode, of this great example, the restaurant of mistaken orders in Japan, which is a restaurant that employs as waiters only old people with dementia. Very openly, the menu is delicious and you order something, you might get something else. It doesn't really matter because everything is good. But there's such a beautiful atmosphere of people working together and really enjoying this experiment together. And, age is an issue. And actually, this leads me also to the next example, which is about care workers. Care work will become more and more important in the future as the population is rapidly aging. And it is also completely made of vulnerable people. Very often they're immigrants or women, and they are not really recognized as a category formally yet and are not protected enough. So it's something that we need to explore in our design work more and more. And my example is a book by Prina Desai, who is an art historian and curator. It's a book called The Indecisive Chicken, Stories and Recipe from 8 Dharavi Women. It was published in 2015. Dharavi is one of the biggest dense neighborhoods in India. It's in Mumbai. And the project originated from Prina's involvement with the NGO Society for Nutrition, Education and Health Action in Mumbai. During her time in the NGO, Prina ran a cooking class in Dharavi, trying to encourage better nutrition and cooking practices. And through this experience, she became deeply engaged with the community and developed a profound appreciation for the women's culinary skills and also the stories behind their recipes. So this work really spotlights the lives and culinary traditions in this neighborhood, but it goes beyond to delve into the stories of these women and give insights into their daily lives. It's almost like a Studs Terkel of the care working domestic industry. And it evolved into comprehensive portrayal that blends gastronomy, culture, and social commentary, providing a deeper understanding of the community's dynamics. So the book is structured around detailed recipes, which I consider also forms of design in a way, using food as a medium to highlight issues of gender, of poverty, of social structures, and making really a statement, a really poignant statement about the resilience and ingenuity of these women, not only showcasing the rich, complex flavors of their cooking, but also giving voice to a marginalized community. And, care work is much more skilled than one thinks. But we need to protect care workers because they will become more and more important in the future. And they are vulnerable, misunderstood, and underpaid in many cases. Some are not paid at all. Most of them are immigrants or women. We need to remember that with our aging population and the tech innovations that are taking over many jobs, the care industry is the future.
Absolutely. Now, for better and sadly for much, much worse, workers' rights will remain high on the agenda for the foreseeable future, given the urgent need to design new approaches to work which are fit for purpose in this century, rather than exploitative, increasingly irrelevant relics from the last one, the appalling treatment of care workers being a prime example of that. As I hope we've demonstrated in this episode of Design Emergency, lots of positive programmes have been designed and implemented in the past and present, from the model workplace at Madeleine Vionnet's fashion house to the digital education provided by startup Lions to young people in rural Kenya who urgently need it and richly deserve it. We'll discover more when a new book by the pioneering social designer Hilary Cottam is published in spring next year. Hilary's first book, Radical Help, which she discussed in an earlier episode of Design Emergency, identified productive ways of redesigning our social systems and has been considered to be a definitive book on social design ever since. Her next book promises to do the same for work, based on years of research into how workers themselves are designing new and more constructive approaches to working and to strengthening their workers' rights. So thank you all for joining Paola and I for this Design Emergency double act on design and workers' rights. You can find images of the projects we've discussed on our Instagram feed at design.emergency, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Design Emergency very soon, when we'll be talking to another global design leader at the forefront of positive change. So goodbye from me and Paola.
Goodbye also from me. Ciao, Alicina.